Hey guys, welcome back to another episode with the Crypto Cowboys. I have two guests on tonight, very special guests. They are the co-founders of the INTERCOIN project. So I've been talking about this for a little bit. I think in terms of payment mechanisms with cryptocurrencies, we haven't seen one being born yet. And I'm not saying this to promote their project, but I think, I think they have a good chance of being one of those cryptocurrencies that could be used as a payment mechanism in the coming years. And it's a very good shot. And I have them both on today, and we're going to talk about INTERCOIN. And gentlemen, we have Jason+Page and Greg. How do you say your last name again, Greg?
Magarshak. Hey,
Magarshak.
guys.
Okay. I butcher last names for a living. So we have Greg and Jason on with us tonight, co-founders of INTERCOIN. Thank you guys for joining us. How are you guys doing tonight?
Good. Here in San Francisco.
Cool. I'm in the East Bay. So we're pretty close.
That's awesome. I'm here in New York City.
Nice.
Brooklyn.
There we go. Cool. So guys, why don't you give the audience a little bit of background on yourselves and, how did you get into the cryptocurrency space and how did INTERCOIN come about? But go ahead and tell us a little bit of your background. Why don't we start with Greg? Because I know you were a pianist, actually, a concert pianist, that is, which is part of your history. So why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and how did you go from being a pianist, which I'm sure you still are, to now building in the cryptocurrency space?
Yeah, that definitely happened. And so growing up as a kid, my mom taught me piano, and I was somewhat of a big deal as a kid. Concert pianist. I played in Carnegie Hall a bunch of times, and then traveled around and was on TV and kind of performed concerts. And it kind of taught me also that things that people normally find kind of out of reach or unusual, hard to achieve, are actually very achievable if you just put one foot in front of the other and you have a plan and where you're going to go. Yep. So I think that mindset that, hey, I can play in Carnegie Hall, I can perform, definitely helps when I'm planning something like a company that might help 1 billion people or something like that.
Yeah, for sure.
And then INTERCOIN's actually my second company. So in 2011, I started Cubix, which was my first company, to decentralize social networking. Back then I didn't know anything about cryptocurrency, but I did feel that Facebook, Twitter, and others were very centralized social networks. Right. And unlike blogging, like where you had WordPress, I didn't see any nice open source alternatives that people could just use and have their own Facebook and own their own data. So since then, that's become sort of more obvious to everyone, because as you hear about Cambridge Analytica or Equifax being hacked, or Marriott recently, and all this stuff, you start to realize, well, maybe it would be nice for people to not put everything in one place.
Right.
And then that might also attract government agencies. It might attract advertisers as well. Everybody wants that data. Besides that, it would be nice if everything was end-to-end encrypted. People were in control of their data. So basically, with those kinds of thoughts, I started Cubix, and we put out these apps, and we got all these users downloading them. So we've got, I think, up to 6 million people now around the world. Wow. Yeah. Nice. They've downloaded our apps, and we're slowly moving with Cubix to having decentralized social network. So why do I mention this? Is because if you think about money, money is sort of, it has a network effect, the same way that a social network has network effect. So, for example, Facebook, when it was just starting, maybe had 5 people, right? It wasn't that useful to Harvard. But if everyone in Harvard uses it, it's very useful. Right. So you don't need the whole world to use Facebook necessarily for it to be useful in a network, a small network. It's the same thing with money. If no one accepts Venmo, right? If no one accepts a certain currency, it's not very useful, because then you need people to join. But if everyone in Harvard accepted a certain currency, right, then that currency would be valuable within Harvard. And that was kind of the insight that, said, okay, maybe we can actually start building a payment network on top of a social network, which a lot of these networks do. So basically, I got into crypto because of Jason, and he could talk a bit about his background. My background is in tech, building teams, architecting these solutions that, need to be there. And Jason kind of, I know him for 10 years. He started coming to my house parties. He could talk a bit about that. And,
Okay.
he got me into crypto. He was talking about Ethereum back in 2014,
Gotcha.
and when it was like $4. And I said, Jason, leave me alone with this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm trying to change the world, decentralizing social networks. But
Right.
ultimately, I took a look a couple years later, and it was, yeah, go ahead. And basically, he got me into crypto, and we realized there were similar problems to solve that we solved.
Yeah. Interesting.
So.
Very cool. Go for it, Jason.
Tried to get me into the Ethereum at 50 cents. So
Who did? I'm sorry.
Joseph Lubin, the co-creator.
Oh, really? Okay, gotcha.
About at 50 cents into Ethereum. And
Wow.
I've been in the crypto space since 2010. I worked with the Bitcoin Center from 2013 to 2015. And I met a lot of people in the crypto space early on.
Yeah.
And been a big believer of the tech behind it. As everybody was just talking about Bitcoin way back in the day, I was starting to get the grasp in 2011, 2012, a little bit of the blockchain and how that was going to affect everyone.
How did you get introduced to Bitcoin back then?
Originally the dark web. That's when I first was Bitcoin. I didn't think too much of it then. And then I really started getting heavily involved in 2012. But I first got introduced to Bitcoin through the dark web, and then Nick Spanos, that created the Bitcoin Center, involved with real estate, and he really got me motivated to be in the space like full time. And I traded Bitcoin, and I took part in lots of early startups in those days in the blockchain space, and several patents that Nick Spanos worked on. I gave some advice and consulting on those projects.
Interesting. So you know a lot of the main players from the beginning, essentially.
Oh, yeah.
The Roger Ver's, Joseph Lubin's.
I saw him a few weeks ago in St. Kitts, Roger Ver.
Interesting. Yeah, see, a lot of people I interview can't say that because they haven't been around long enough. So this would be a good time. So
that's Jason's one of the OGs, huh?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely one of the OGs. You and Daniel. I mean, that's how I met you guys, is through Daniel. And I met him at Blockchain Week in San Francisco a couple months ago. You guys are definitely OGs. You've been around since 2010. That's pretty serious.
Yeah, I know Daniel from the Bitcoin Center. So.
Nice. Very cool. So you guys have this company by the name of Cubix. And Cubix is essentially a decentralized social network. And I find it interesting, Greg, that you're building this social network with having a network that is decentralized in mind at the time, and not really dabbling in cryptocurrencies, especially Bitcoin at the time. I think that's pretty fascinating, if you ask me. So we know that INTERCOIN was born from just being in the cryptocurrency space and wanting to build on top of this Cubix social network. Why don't we dive into INTERCOIN now? Tell us exactly what INTERCOIN is, and how does INTERCOIN's ecosystem, what differentiates INTERCOIN from all the other cryptocurrencies, the main ones, meaning like Bitcoin, Ethereum, etc. How does INTERCOIN solve like the scaling issue that is currently the bottleneck of Bitcoin's network and most of the proof of work cryptocurrency networks or blockchains?
Right.
That is. That was a loaded question, but
it's like almost a rite of passage to say that you started your network to do what Satoshi or Bitcoin was supposed to do originally.
Sure. Yeah.
But we mean it in a completely different way. It was supposed to be a peer-to-peer cash system, right? The idea, even earlier, there was Ripple was actually, the original Ripple was designed in 2004 by this guy, Ryan Fugger.
Right.
And that was a way to settle up debts between friends with what's called trust lines now. And, it's used in Lightning Network. So I'll talk about that a little later. But a peer-to-peer cash system, right? That sounds a bit like people paying each other, right?
Right.
The thing is, with Bitcoin, when we looked at the space, we looked at Bitcoin and Ethereum, they're based in proof of work. And I think that captured a lot of people's imagination early on, and that really led to the boom and investment in the space. So that's very, very powerful.
Right.
But at the same time, proof of work, it's very hard to get from proof of work to sort of scaling, because when you have essentially a miner, what the miner does is it has to validate all the transactions that it gets. In other words, every transaction in the world has to go through one computer or one, ASIC that solves this particular thing. And we don't even know which one it will be in advance. So you have to essentially gossip every transaction to every potential miner.
Right.
So sending everything to everyone, as you can imagine, doesn't scale as well. So to give you an example, other systems, like the internet, if you add more computers to that network, right?
Yeah.
To the network of networks, you can send more emails. You can send more, have more conversations.
Right.
Almost any protocol you choose, email, right? The World Wide Web, HTTP, FTP, whatever. The more participants you have, the more communication you can have. Sort of with proof of work, there was this thing where no matter how many computers you throw at it, it would still do the exact same amount. Maybe seven transactions per second in the case of Bitcoin.
Right.
Maybe 20 transactions in the case of Ethereum. And it was like, well, that's not a scalable architecture necessarily in and of itself, right?
Right.
So then there's talk of like doing layer 2 technologies. But to me, that's a bit of a cop-out because you're going back to maybe centralized systems. And we could talk about Lightning Network and others,
Sure.
but I think since 2008, there has been a lot of innovation and other tracks people have taken. I mean, certainly there's been Stellar and Ripple, and people have been using other architectures like IOTA. But one that really resonates with me, because it's not just useful for money, but it's useful for all kinds of group activities, is essentially the architecture that is used in BitTorrent. And that goes all the way back to 2002. It's called distributed hash tables, and I could talk a bit about that. But the idea is essentially, so what is the idea of Intercoin? The idea of an Intercoin is that, look, money is more of a local phenomenon, first of all, that each community might want to have its own currency on the community level, and that you might want to have essentially, as a community, you might want to have some control over your own currency, your own monetary policy. I could give examples where, Greece was maybe better off when they had their own currency before they joined the Eurozone, as one example. I mean, some cities do have their own currency, and you could look at how that affects the life in the city and how well they can reinvest locally into themselves.
Right.
Just having the ability to have your own currency, I think, is powerful. And there's going to be applications that we haven't thought of. There's many we have thought of that we're building out. So it's kind of like Ethereum, 2.0, where it's scalable. Every community has its own currency. It's sort of its own ledger, And that opens up other possibilities, because we feel that having one currency for everybody, one size fits all currency, is both on an economic and a technological level is not going to take off. And you can see for 10 years, Bitcoin's been out, and how many people are using it to like buy a coffee, right?
No,
you can't really, exactly, because it doesn't handle that number of transactions.
Right. It's more of a store of value at this point. So definitely agree with that. So what is like Intercoin's a consensus algorithm? Like, how does Intercoin scale and still remain immutable?
So Intercoin's consensus algorithm is very similar to sort of these emerging new technologies. One is the SAFE network, Made Safe.
Okay.
You may have heard of it a few years ago, but you can go check it out. They continually make progress. The thing about, so they're a great team from out of Scotland, and I'm in touch with them. I've been talking to them for, I think since last year.
Okay.
So they've been at this for 12 years, okay?
Wow.
They started before Bitcoin. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So again, there's all these people out there with these ideas for how to run decentralized social networks.
Right.
And Holochain is another one. What all these have in common, Safe Network, Holochain, Intercoin we're being built, is that they're more based on what's called distributed hash tables. So like BitTorrent. So before I get into any specifics, just at a high level, right? If you've ever used BitTorrent, right? First of all, the history of BitTorrent is that there was Napster, right? And you would sort of share files, share music. And Napster relied on sort of centralized trackers, right? That if you took out those trackers, nobody could find where the files were stored, basically.
Got it.
And so that was a central point of failure. So they invented distributed hash tables. One of the main techniques that's used in all these hash tables now, it's called Kademlia.
Okay.
And this guy invented it. He's actually was an NYU professor.
Okay.
And he's in New York, and he's one of our advisors. He's one of the guys, sort of a consultant that I'm, that we meet with. So Pitar Maimunkov. So essentially, what is distributed hash table? It's a resilient routing table, okay? Routing table that's not stored in one place, but it's sort of rebalancing itself all the time.
Okay.
And in a way, it's basically computers and files are stored in this abstract space. You could think of as like 160 dimensional space, or a space of numbers which are 160 bits long.
Sure.
And what happens is essentially that computers which are close to the file host that file. Okay.
Got it.
So in order to find the file, you don't any longer go to one computer. You can sort of hop between computers in the space, getting closer and closer to the file.
Gotcha.
And that's the way Kademlia works. It stores computers which are halfway to the file, halfway around the world in this space, a quarter of the way around the world, an eighth of the way, and so on. So by storing sort of these buckets, you can get to any file. And the point is that if any one of these computers is even found or compromised or is removed, the network can easily patch itself around that. So why do I mention this? Because tokens in or any group activity really, are special cases of files in this sort of BitTorrent. You can imagine sort of each token on the Intercoin network being a file, right, in a BitTorrent network.
Yeah.
It's similar. So you go ahead, you find this token, you see who it belongs to, and then the recipient goes ahead, does the same thing, and if they see it really belongs to them, then they release the goods. And that's sort of a big piece of the architecture.
Very interesting, man. Okay, so I get you guys have this parent company or this decentralized social network, Cubics. How does Intercoin get integrated into the Cubics social network? Or do I need to participate even in the Cubics social network to use Intercoin? If you can kind of...
Jason could talk a little bit about the how Intercoin is layered as a payment network on top. Because there's many payment networks and many social networks that have started to add payments. But I'm going to talk about the technology a bit. Cubics, first of all, has many people running our applications. Some of them are running on phones, and some of them are running on Mac computers, which are on pretty much 24/7, plugged into the wall, etc. And so if you take those computers, we have 40,000 Macs around the world running our apps and our software. So of course, you can update the software with the App Store. And you can pretty much put a library in there that does things like watch for forks and watch for validation, right? Yeah. A lot of these other companies, they have their own data center. I think Neo or EOS, right? They have their own they control all the hardware. They get all the computers, and bootstrap with that. And the result is, they call it decentralized, but how decentralized is it if you control all the computers? You can put whatever software you want on it. You kind of people are trusting you for that, as opposed to, let's say, a protocol like Bitcoin, which is run on many different computers. So Intercoin is essentially building on top of Cubics's technology infrastructure initially. And we made an experiment back in March, and maybe Jason could talk a bit about this too, where we actually tried Monero mining inside our apps, and we got covered by the BBC and Newsweek for this unintentionally because people were surprised.
Interesting. Very cool.
So we took out the Monero mining. It was too heavy. Proof of work is very heavy.
Right.
But what we're planning to do is we're planning to do a lot less heavy work. Apple told us that you can't burn a person's CPU that much. for
Right.
for things like crypto, but we're planning to do things which use only 1% of the CPU and like very little memory. So that's sort of how the technology piece works. But Jason, maybe you could talk a bit about how payment networks are being rolled out by social networks.
Well, so with Cubics, we're going to start there, and then from there, other social networks can have this payment layer of Intercoin on top of it. And Intercoin is, we like to see as programmable money, like true programmable money. That's what I've been envisioning for a long time, and hoping to see in this space currencies actually being used.
Yeah.
And with this, from these communities can develop local fintech that this programmable money can be used in your own individual communities for all the different needs the community has, like basic income to all sorts of things that we can have adopted by having tech done this way. And I see it as Cubics is the starting point of Intercoin's payment layer, but it will go on other social networks and expand and evolve over time. I see communities building their own dApps. So the point of Intercoin is to be interoperable between other DLTs or blockchains and with their own dApps that will intersect, and Intercoin is the bridge currency between them. So, and Intercoin is built as sound money that each community would hold 100% reserve in Intercoin, and then issue their own local currency. So Intercoin is to give stability in the space and help everything scale and give back the freedoms of a community to make their own decisions of how money works and what they would want to do in their own community.
Interesting. Okay, so how do local communities? Maybe you answered this already when you were talking about your consensus, but how do local communities like maintain their local money and still like safeguard from potential like collusion? If that makes sense. I don't know if that question really applies.
Well, I don't know about collusion. By the way, does the video switch to me when I speak, or is it?
Yeah, right now we're like in a grid, so we're all in the same. But if you want to, like, anytime you want to, because I know you have something you want to share on the screen, so anytime you want to share, take over the screen. But yeah, we can see all three of us at the same time.
That's actually a good suggestion. Let me try to share this screen. Let me know if that works.
Yeah, that worked. Full screen.
Perfect. All right, so this is our website. Intercoin is the next step in the evolution of money. So the idea is right there on the front screen. Basically, we're trying to build the internet of money. And just like the internet is a global network that connects local networks, it's not just one giant network. The same thing you have essentially with Intercoin, except instead of these being local networks of with a printer or like local university, Wi-Fi network, this would be a local currency. So essentially the insight of Intercoin is, hey, most transactions happen locally, right? And these are the transactions that we want to facilitate within the community. Like, for example, a student of Harvard going, to stick with that example, going to the local bar, maybe the local cafeteria, spending money there, right? The cafeteria owner would take the money the same way they would take maybe another form of payment if that money was widespread within Harvard, right?
Yeah.
So it sort of creates, it sort of cordons off these communities and says, look, if we get successful within that one community, we've done most of the work. That's good enough. Same way, if the Facebook was just in Harvard, it would be useful in Harvard. And that's a major thing. You don't have to take over the whole world to be successful in that community.
Right.
So that definitely cuts down on the problem. I come from a math background, so anytime you can, or even a programming background, anytime you can break down a problem into like sub-problems, right? That can be solved in and of themselves, and that's a progress. So I think to get something to be used as a payment network, that's the way to go. So the communities, they issue their own currency. That's kind of the presentation I want to give.
Please.
We have several. Let's go to the, I guess, the economics presentation of it. Let's see. Does that second tab show up in your?
Yeah, I see Intercoin economics as the first page. Yeah, the
So,
floor is yours. Go for it.
okay, so suppose you want to do your own ICO, and let's call it Netflix.
Okay.
Because this is a canonical example of like a micropayment network, right? Something you cannot do with Bitcoin or Ethereum.
Right.
So what happens is essentially you've got your own token, call it the Netflix token, and you give it to potential watchers of movies, which would be the consumers, right? So the consumers, what do they do with it? They pay producers to watch movies, right? I mean, of course, you could have speculators buying up a lot of tokens, not to watch movies, and we'll get into that. But for now, presumably buying these tokens to watch movies. Now, a producer winds up with a lot of tokens, and of course, they don't need to watch so many movies, million movies. No, what they want to do is essentially they want to cash out. And so the next thing you got to do is you got to basically get your ICO onto an exchange, right? Just to get liquidity so producers can sell it back to like future consumers. So if you're just building a token that's a utility token, right? Because now with regulators, they've kind of chilled that whole market, as we all know.
Yeah.
But if we go back to like what the dream was that all the VCs were talking about, of network participants owning the network, right? And it being decentralized, then what we have is that producers would want to sell it back to the next consumer. Well, of course, that means you got to beg exchanges to list you, which is also a hurdle.
Yeah.
What INTERCOIN does is it says, look, we're going to be the coin that's between all the communities. We're going to provide liquidity in and out of your community. Okay. So now suddenly you can start a community with no permission. I'll explain, how that works, because INTERCOIN's the one being traded on exchanges for you. So all you got to do is basically get traded for INTERCOIN. So what Jason was talking about, INTERCOIN being held on full reserve. Well, essentially what that means is, imagine if all the Harvard vendors or all the Netflix producers would want to cash out at the same time, like a run on the bank kind of thing.
Yeah.
So most banks wouldn't be able to handle that because they have fractional reserve, right? So they would need a lender upstream, which is like, the Fed, something from the reserve system. But of course, if you have a full reserve, you don't need that. And we want to encourage sound money. So in a way, INTERCOIN is like the 19th century sort of a free banking era where each bank would have gold on reserve.
Right.
And it would then, you could start a bank by having people deposit gold, same way you could deposit INTERCOIN. And then you would have your banknotes circulating within your community, essentially. And people could cash out. Of course, the difference was that the banks decided to have fractional reserves.
Right.
Because, most of the time, not all money is being put to use. So they figured, hey, why don't we lend some out? Which, it leads to an elastic economy, but also creates instability, creates some potential problems down the road. So we've chosen to at least start off and have a network with full reserve, because we feel that, if you're going to have a community, we need to make sure this money has the right trust. People can trust this money, that they won't suddenly have a fractional reserve unless it is agreed upon in advance. And that's the other thing about programmable money, Jason could talk about, is that the rules are programmed in advance. So when you're depositing money on the way in, right, we can program any rules you want. Say that this was let's say this was a startup. Oh, here we go. This is an example. When people are adding value to a startup, it's very likely that the founders will first use up some of the money on startup costs, like building the network or whatever.
Right.
So whoever provides these services is going to cash out and remove value from. So this would actually be a funding mechanism for movies or drug research or anything else. You've got a project and you have startup costs, right?
Yeah.
And then these consumers end up with these tokens, but the reserves aren't there anymore, right?
Right.
Over time, though, if the project is successful, what happens is more value is pumped back into the project, where this initial imbalance is corrected. So if you notice, one thing is that INTERCOIN's ecosystem does not have market prices. That's kind of unusual. right? You've got market prices over here. It's free floating against, the pound, the dollar, the euro, Bitcoin. Okay, we can't mess with this side of the equation because there's arbitrage, right?
Right.
There's no way that we can, change the spot prices as much as we want. But within the ecosystem, right here, the other side, the right side, we have full control. The network essentially says, well, the exchange rate of this local currency to Intercoin is exactly the amount of Intercoin you've got on reserve, right?
Gotcha.
Divided by how much local currency you've got circulating.